How's everyone who's watching this? This is my 34th video channel. Today we're going to be starting Chapter 3 of Intensive Science and Virtual Philosophy by Manuel DeLanda, titled The Actualisation of a Virtual in Time. In the last episode, we delved into what exactly Deleuze means when he talks about intensities and introduced the concept of the quasi-cause and the plane of consistency. In this video, we'll begin exploring the role of time in Deleuze's theory. Although before we get there, DeLanda starts by saying this.
There is a conflict at the heart of physics, a conflict between two forms of scientific temporality.
What he's referring to here is a tension between classical mechanics on the one hand and thermodynamics on the other. At the root of the issue is what DeLanda calls the reversibility of time. This doesn't mean that time can somehow be played back, as if with some sort of strange Deleuzian time machine. Instead, reversibility refers to the ability for a particular sequence of events to be inverted temporally and still have the same properties. This is possible in classical mechanics, but not in thermodynamics. To demonstrate this, an example of reversibility brought to us by the former involves throwing a ball upwards inside a vacuum that falls back to its original position. If we were to rewind that and see what happened backwards, nothing would change. However, if we look at thermodynamics, nothing of the sort is possible. A process like diffusion, for example, usually dampens small differences, but reversing it amplifies them. Placing these phenomena in mathematical terms, DeLanda says,
while the laws of classical and relativistic physics remain invariant under a time reversal transformation, the laws of thermodynamics do not.
To deal with this conflict, many physicists do their best to ignore irreversibility. However, this approach has been made problematic by a number of critics, like Ilya Prigogine. In the Nobel Prize-winning chemist's eyes, the valorization of reversibility leads to what he calls a static universe, one where there is being without becoming. The ball is what matters, not the processes that affect it. Yet this is in complete contradiction to Deleuze's ontology, which firmly stresses the importance of processes and sees stable objects only as byproducts. Deleuze's world, in DeLanda's words, is
a universe where individual beings do exist, but only as the outcome of becomings, that is, of irreversible process of individuation.
However, as our author underlines, Deleuze's way of viewing time goes far beyond the distinction between what is reversible and what isn't. Just like we did with space in the last couple episodes, we have to develop a virtual continuum of time that is split up and differentiated into the familiar actual time that we live in. To do this, DeLanda says, we first have to make a distinction between extensive and intensive components. Considering the first, this is what we see in clocks. Little discrete units with a given duration, like seconds, minutes, or what have you. These units are measurable through things that can perform regular sequences of oscillations, where something moves back and forth between states periodically. For example, the pendulum in an old grandfather clock plays with this role. Each swing corresponds to 1 second. This form of time is what DeLanda wants to focus on first, introducing the work of the nonlinear physicist Arthur Eibroll to explain it. Essentially, the core of Eibroll's theory is that time is a nested set of oscillations that increase in duration. This might sound quite a bit daunting, but can be observed in just how we talk about time, in terms of seconds, nested in minutes, which are in turn nested in hours, shown in this diagram. This matches quite nicely with what we talked about 2 episodes ago, where species were examined through the lens of being individuals in their own right, their cells being each member animal or plant. Additionally, it allows us to think about these species and organisms in terms of the different temporal scales they exist at. The relatively small lifespan of, say, a certain cat is nested inside that of a much longer lasting species. However, this situation is far from cut and dry. Everything exists on a myriad of different timescales, from cycles of life and death to those concerning breathing and movement. For convenience sake, DeLanda says,
we can assign, by convention, a particularly prominent timescale to each individual level, such as the cycle, which measures the maintenance of their identity.
This cycle concerns the replacement of all an individual's cells, be that literally for organisms or more metaphorically for species, without anything changing in their identity. The reason why DeLanda singles it out is to explain how bifurcations, also known as symmetry-breaking transformations, affect time. From the field of nonlinear dynamics, this part of the book focuses on one particular symmetry-breaking transformation, the Hopf bifurcation, which takes point attractors and turns them into periodic ones. To give a quick refresher, point and periodic attractors are two types of singularity, points that organize the trajectory of processes that fall into their basin of attraction. Whilst point attractors take trajectories and direct them to a single state, periodic attractors instead cause trajectories to oscillate or cycle between multiple different ones. With this in mind, we can diagram the half bifurcation like so. Note that the state is connected to the attractors, but also separate. Singularities in Deleuze's ontology are purely virtual, meaning that they can never truly be reached. Having undergone a half bifurcation, an oscillator, meaning a system that undergoes oscillations like that of the identity-maintaining cycle, moves from being linear to nonlinear. The main difference between the two is that linear oscillators have an interval between their states reliant on initial starting conditions, whilst non-linear oscillators have what DeLanda calls a characteristic period, defined as being unrelated to any outside factors. Abrol's theory is heavily based on this notion of intrinsic time. For him, time doesn't appear fully metric or extensive out of nowhere. Rather, it's through this unfolding of a set of nonlinear oscillators that we get the cycles familiar to us. In DeLanda's words,
in a sense, each oscillation would synthesize a pulse of metric time, many nested sequences of these pulses yielding the familiar form of time which we humans can measure.
This closely connects to Deleuze's own notion of Chronos, developed in his 1969 work, Logic of Sense. Basically, under this form of time, everything exists in the present. There is no such thing as the past, but rather only the present as it was. Likewise, the future gives way to the present as it will be. This works because of how time acts as a nested set of durations. The lived present of one entity's oscillations, like say that of a cat, always pales in comparison to the oscillations of some other entity, such as that of a star. At this point, DeLanda turns his attention towards the intensive aspect of time. To do this, he introduces the work of another scientist, Arthur Winfrey, who experimented on the biological oscillators, in other words, the internal clocks, of mosquitoes and fruit flies. What Winfrey found was that when an intense enough shock, what he calls a critical stimulus, is applied to such an oscillator, it undergoes a destructive transformation. For example, an entire population of mosquitoes becoming permanent insomniacs, as seen in this diagram. It's important to note that the critical stimulus isn't a cause in of itself of the oscillator's transformation, but rather is only a trigger. This is because, in DeLanda's words,
what effect the shock will have will depend on the internal intensive structure of the oscillator itself.
To illustrate this, he gives two examples of an oscillator's structure. Firstly, there's a configuration of a periodic attractor organized around a specific point, which Winfrey calls a black hole. When a critical stimulus is applied to such an oscillator, it is thrown completely out of whack, its oscillations being annihilated, to use DeLanda's turn of phrase. If, on the other hand, the periodic attractor has multiple states, a critical stimulus might lead to a more complicated relationship with time, one that's arrhythmic and ambiguous. The reason Winfrey's results are interesting to us, even if the specifics aren't too important, is because of their mechanism independence, something we looked at in the first episode of the series. Basically, critical stimuli aren't bound to this or that set of conditions, but rather can be actualized by any number of diverse systems. More than just the interior clock of mosquitoes or fruit flies, the stimuli can cause the annihilation or transformation of oscillations into things like yeast cells or even inorganic chemical reactions. Moreover, as DeLanda says,
other aspects of Winfrey's work on oscillators illustrate a different feature of the intensive, the ability of nonlinear oscillators to synchronize or entrain one another's temporal behavior.
This connects to what we discussed last episode in terms of affects, the capacities things have for affecting and being affected by others. To bring up a diagram from that episode, we can see how gravitational fields, animals and the land they walk on can all be connected together by affects to form what Deleuze and Guattari call an assemblage. The intensive, as we saw last time, essentially forms the outside, which allows for these relationships to be formed heterogeneously, that is, without any entity subsuming another. When it comes to time, nonlinear oscillators are able to form assemblages amongst each other. For example, our circadian rhythms line up with cycles outside of ourselves, such as that of the day and night cycle, or the Earth's rotation. At this point of the book, DeLanda comes to summarize what Winfrey's work tells us about Chronos, or metric time. Basically, it shows that it, as a set of nested oscillations, is not a homogeneous series of identical instances, 1 second, 2 seconds, and so on and so on. Instead, as seen how oscillators can be annihilated or transformed, there is a collection of singular and ordinary events. The first, again like we went over last time, concerns those that exist on critical thresholds between states, just like water at just under 100 degrees centigrade. A circadian rhythm on the verge of experiencing critical stimuli is singular. Between these events lie ordinary ones, an infinite number of possible states. There is thus no such thing as a single instant in Chronos, but rather cycles of varying lengths. Expanding on the role of intensity, DeLanda now turns to another part of Winfrey's work. More specifically, he says that the notion we talked about in terms of affects takes us beyond sequences and into what he calls parallel temporal structures, the ways in which assemblages of nonlinear oscillators can act in unison to become one big parallel process. To demonstrate this, he takes an example of the slime mold Dictostellium. Early in its life cycle, there are a myriad of amoebae, each with their own specific cycles or oscillators governing their behavior. However, once a singular point has been reached, a low availability of nutrients, that critical stimulus triggers large populations of those amoebae to congregate into one thing, with differentiated heterogeneous parts. In other words, they form an assemblage, complete with a synchronized oscillator. Like DeLanda relates,
As one scientist has remarked, witnessing this phenomenon, one may really be watching a replay of the basic kinds of events responsible for the appearance of the first multicellular organisms.
Now, before we end this half of the chapter, our author seeks to summarize what we discussed in this episode. Namely, he wants to explain what Iberol and Winfrey's work tells us about the genesis or birth of metric time. Essentially, the cycles that make it up start with temporal symmetry breaking transformations, like the Hopf bifurcation, which takes a specific state and gives it an intrinsic duration. However, this alone explains nothing. It's purely formal when not considering the role of intensity. By introducing Winfrey's work, we saw how the timescales that form or unfold through cascades of transformations have specific intensive properties, like different configurations and the ability to synchronize. Yet, DeLanda maintains this still isn't enough. Like how the metaphor of non-metric space becoming metric that we examined in the last couple episodes had to be substantially reworked to include all the subtleties and complexities of intensity, we have to do the same for the visual continuum of time. However, this is something for the next episode. With this, we're done with the first half of Chapter 3 from Manuel DeLanda's book Intensive Science and Visual Philosophy. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something. If you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. In the next video, we'll finish the chapter and pick up where we left off here, exploring many of the things that we looked at the last couple episodes through the lens of time and nonlinear oscillators. Until then, bye!